Moving day dawned bright and warm, with a crisp breeze that hinted at the changing season. Amanda Pierce stood on the curb outside 17 Sycamore Lane, her hands resting on her hips as she surveyed the old house. Despite its slightly weathered exterior, there was something undeniably charming about it. The way the morning sunlight glinted off the bay windows, the gentle creak of the porch swing swaying in the breeze. Ellie, her 9-year-old daughter, raced up the front steps, her sneakers thudding on the wooden boards. "This is it, Mom. This is our house," she called out, her voice brimming with excitement. Amanda smiled, brushing a strand of auburn hair from her face. It had been a difficult few years, a messy divorce, endless financial struggles, but this house represented a fresh start, a new chapter for her and her daughters. As movers began unloading boxes from the truck, Amanda felt a flicker of hope for the first time in a long while. Sophie, her 6-year-old, clung to Amanda's leg, her thumb in her mouth. "Do you think the house likes us?" she asked quietly, her blue eyes wide with curiosity. Amanda chuckled, ruffling Sophie's hair. "Of course it does, sweetie. It's going to be our home now." The day passed in a blur of unpacking and organizing. The girls chose their rooms, Ellie claiming the larger one at the end of the hall, Sophie opting for the smaller room next to Amanda's. By evening, they were all exhausted but happy, sitting cross-legged on the living room floor, eating pizza out of the box. As the sun set and shadows stretched long across the walls, Amanda began to notice how eerily quiet the neighborhood was. The usual sounds of suburbia, dogs barking, cars driving by, were absent. Instead, there was a stillness, a sort of oppressive silence that seemed to seep into the house itself. "It's too quiet here," Ellie remarked, her mouth full of pizza. "I miss the city." "You'll get used to it," Amanda replied, though she couldn't shake the uneasy feeling creeping up her spine. That night, after tucking the girls into bed, Amanda wandered through the house, checking locks and turning off lights. She paused in the living room, her gaze drawn to the rocking chair she had found in the basement earlier that day. It was an antique, with intricate carvings and a high back. Despite its beauty, something about it felt off. She had placed it in the corner of the room, thinking it might add a touch of charm, but now it seemed almost out of place, as though it didn't belong there, or anywhere. Amanda shook her head, chiding herself for being silly, and headed upstairs to bed. She fell asleep quickly, lulled by the exhaustion of the day, but her dreams were restless, filled with fleeting images of shadowy figures and a soft, unfamiliar melody that seemed to echo from far away. She woke suddenly in the middle of the night, her heart pounding. For a moment, she couldn't figure out what had disturbed her. The house was dark, the only sound the faint hum of the refrigerator downstairs. But as she lay there, straining to listen, she thought she heard something, a faint creaking sound, like wood groaning under weight. It was coming from the living room. Amanda's mouth went dry. She reached for her phone, illuminating the screen to check the time. 3:12 a.m. Taking a deep breath, she swung her legs over the side of the bed and crept toward the door. The hallway was pitch black, and as she descended the stairs, the creaking grew louder, more rhythmic. It was unmistakably the sound of the rocking chair. When she reached the living room, she froze. The chair was moving, rocking back and forth, slow and steady. No one was there. Amanda's breath caught in her throat, and for a moment, she was paralyzed with fear. Then, with a sudden burst of courage, she reached out and grabbed the back of the chair, stopping its motion. The room fell silent. Amanda stood there, her hand trembling on the carved wood, her mind racing for a rational explanation. A draft, perhaps? The uneven floorboards of the old house? But even as she tried to convince herself, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her. She turned and hurried back upstairs, her footsteps quick and light. That night, she slept with the lights on. Morning came, and the unsettling events of the previous night felt like a distant memory, almost as if they had been part of a vivid nightmare. Amanda busied herself preparing breakfast, brushing off her unease. Ellie and Sophie bounded down the stairs, their energy dispelling the eerie quiet of the house. By mid-afternoon, Amanda found herself unpacking boxes in the basement. The space was cluttered with forgotten remnants of the house's past. dusty furniture, old trunks, and stacks of yellowing newspapers. As she rummaged through the debris, she unearthed an old photo album. Curious, she flipped through its pages, finding black and white photographs of a family from decades ago. A stern-looking man, a woman with hollow eyes, and two children who bore faint, almost unsettling smiles. One photograph caught her attention. It showed the living room exactly as it was now, with a rocking chair in the corner. Amanda stared at it, her stomach twisting. The chair hadn't moved from that spot in all these years. That night, the whispers began. Amanda was the first to hear them, a faint murmur that seemed to emanate from the walls. She froze, holding her breath, straining to make out the words. They were indistinct, just out of reach, but unmistakably human. She glanced at the girls, who were engrossed in a movie, oblivious to the sound. By the next day, the whispers grew louder. Ellie stormed into the kitchen, her face flushed with frustration. "Mom, can you tell Sophie to stop whispering at night? It's creeping me out." Amanda frowned. "Sophie was asleep all night, Ellie. Are you sure you weren't dreaming?" Ellie glared at her. "I know what I heard, Mom. It's not just whispers. It's talking." Amanda tried to reassure her, but doubt gnawed at her mind. That night, as she lay in bed, the whispers returned, louder than before. They seemed to move through the house, drifting from room to room. Amanda got up to investigate, her heart pounding in her chest. As she stepped into the hallway, she saw it, shadows shifting across the walls, darker than the surrounding night, as though something unseen was moving past her. The next morning, Sophie refused to leave her room. "The walls are talking to me," she whispered, her small hands gripping her blanket tightly. Amanda's blood ran cold. She decided to call the real estate agent, hoping for answers. The agent's voice was hesitant, guarded. "There's nothing on the record, Mrs. Pierce. Just stories. Some say the house has a history, but I'm sure it's just small-town gossip." Amanda wasn't convinced. She spent the rest of the day researching the house, poring over old town records and archives. What she found was chilling. The house had changed hands many times, each owner leaving abruptly after strange occurrences. And then there were the disappearances, 2 children in the 1950s, a teenager in the 1970s, all vanishing without a trace. Each case remained unsolved. By the 3rd week, the atmosphere in the house had shifted entirely. The once cozy rooms now felt oppressive, the air heavy and cold. Amanda began to notice changes in her daughters. Ellie became withdrawn, her vibrant personality dimmed, while Sophie started talking to herself, whispering under her breath to someone or something that wasn't there. One night, Amanda woke to the sound of Sophie crying. She rushed to her room, only to find her daughter sitting on the floor, her eyes wide with terror. "It doesn't like us, Mommy," Sophie whimpered. "It said we need to leave." Amanda held Sophie close, her mind racing. "What isn't like us, sweetheart? What are you talking about?" Sophie pointed to the corner of the room. "The man in the shadows. He watches me at night." Amanda turned to look, but the corner was empty. Still, the hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. She knew then that they couldn't stay in the house, but leaving was easier said than done. Financially strapped, Amanda couldn't afford to move again so soon. Desperate, she reached out to a local paranormal investigator. The woman, an older medium named Clara, arrived the following evening. As she stepped into the house, Clara's face immediately darkened. "This place has seen too much pain," she murmured. Clara performed a cleansing ritual, walking through the house with burning sage, chanting softly. But as she entered the living room, the air grew icy, and the whispers returned, louder and angrier than ever. The rocking chair began to move on its own, violently rocking back and forth. Clara's chanting faltered, and she turned to Amanda, her expression grim. "You need to leave. Now." After Clara's departure, the house seemed to turn against them. Lights flickered uncontrollably, appliances turned on and off, and objects flew off shelves. Ellie screamed one night when she found her mirror covered in handprints, small, childlike handprints that weren't hers or Sophie's. Amanda tried to keep the girls calm, but fear consumed them all. Sleep became impossible, each night filled with new horrors. One evening, as Amanda sat in the kitchen, she heard a loud bang from upstairs. She raced to the girls' room, only to find their beds empty. Panic gripped her as she called out their names, her voice trembling. She found Ellie and Sophie huddled in the hallway, their faces pale. "They tried to take us," Ellie sobbed. "The shadows. They tried to pull us into the walls." Amanda had had enough. She packed a bag and loaded the girls into the car, vowing never to return. But as they pulled out of the driveway, Amanda glanced back at the house. In the upstairs window, she saw it. A dark figure standing perfectly still, watching them leave. Amanda and her daughters never returned to 17 Sycamore Lane. They moved to a small apartment in the next town, their lives forever marked by the experience. Amanda never spoke of it to anyone, but Ellie and Sophie carried the memories with them. The whispers, the shadows, and the figure in the rocking chair. The house, abandoned once more, fell into disrepair. Neighbors spoke in hushed tones about the screams they sometimes heard at night, the lights that flickered in the empty rooms, and the rocking chair that moved on its own. No one dared to enter. Decades later, the house was demolished, but even then, the land remained barren. Local legends grew, each tale more chilling than the last, cementing 17 Sycamore Lane as the place where shadows lived and whispered, and where they never let go. The Winters family, Thomas, Rebecca, and their 6-year-old son, Jamie, had been desperate for a change. Life in the city had become a relentless grind of noise, smog, and sleepless nights. When Thomas, a struggling novelist, found Blackwood Cottage listed at a fraction of its value, it felt like fate. The picturesque stone cottage was tucked deep in a forest, miles from the nearest town. It seemed the perfect escape, quiet, secluded, and brimming with the rustic charm Rebecca had always dreamed of. The family arrived in the late afternoon, their car crunching over the gravel driveway as the sun dipped low in the sky. The cottage stood at the center of a small clearing, surrounded by towering pines that swayed gently in the breeze. Rebecca stepped out of the car, inhaling deeply, the fresh air filling her lungs. "This is it," she said, turning to Thomas with a smile. "This is the fresh start we need." Jamie, clutching his favorite stuffed bear, looked less certain. He lingered by the car, his wide eyes scanning the shadowy woods. "It's too quiet," he whispered. Thomas laughed, ruffling Jamie's hair. "That's the point, buddy. No noisy neighbors, no honking cars, just peace and quiet." As they unloaded their belongings, Rebecca marveled at the house's charm. Its ivy-covered stone walls and quaint wooden shutters gave it an almost storybook-like appearance. Inside, the cottage was cozy but worn, with creaky wooden floors, low-beamed ceilings, and a massive stone fireplace that dominated the living room. By the time the last box was unpacked, the sun had set, casting the forest in deep shadows. As they sat down to dinner, a simple meal of sandwiches and chips, the silence Rebecca had initially found so appealing began to feel oppressive. No birds, no crickets, not even the rustling of leaves. It was as if the forest itself were holding its breath. Later that night, after Jamie was tucked into bed, Rebecca and Thomas sat by the fireplace. Thomas sipped whiskey, his mind already racing with ideas for his next book, while Rebecca leafed through an old gardening journal she had found on the dusty bookshelf. The house seemed to settle around them, the fires crackling the only sound in the stillness. But upstairs, Jamie couldn't sleep. He lay in bed clutching his bear, his eyes fixed on the dark corner of his room. There was something there, something he couldn't see but could feel. He pulled the blanket over his head, his small body trembling. And then he heard it, a whisper, soft and close, as if someone were leaning over him. "Jamie," it breathed. "Come play with me." Jamie screamed, his voice piercing the night. Thomas and Rebecca bolted up the stairs, their hearts racing. They found him sitting upright in bed, tears streaming down his face. "There's someone in my room," he cried, pointing to the corner. Rebecca flicked on the light, revealing nothing but shadows and furniture. "It's just a bad dream, sweetheart," she said, pulling him into her arms. But as she hugged him, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. After Jamie's terrifying experience on the first night, Rebecca resolved to put on a brave face. She assured her son it had been just a bad dream and busied herself the next day, making the house feel more like home. She hung curtains, scrubbed the kitchen, and even started a small herb garden in the yard. But Jamie remained subdued, his usual energetic demeanor replaced by a quiet, almost somber mood. Thomas, meanwhile, dove into his writing, retreating to the small study upstairs. "The isolation is perfect," he told Rebecca over breakfast. "No distractions, just me, the forest, and my thoughts." Rebecca smiled, but inside, her unease was growing. She couldn't shake the feeling that Jamie's fear wasn't entirely unfounded. There was something about the cottage, its silence, its stillness, that felt unnatural. That night, Rebecca tucked Jamie into bed, lingering by his door longer than usual. "If you need anything, just call for me, okay?" she said softly. Jamie nodded, clutching his bear. "Will you stay close?" he whispered. "I'll be right here," she promised. Hours later, Rebecca awoke to a sound. At first, she thought it was the wind, but as she lay still, straining to listen, she realized it was something else entirely. A faint, rhythmic tapping, as if someone were gently knocking on the walls. She nudged Thomas, but he only grumbled and rolled over. Frustrated, she got up to investigate. The tapping seemed to move as she walked through the house, always staying just ahead of her. It led her to the living room, where the fireplace had gone cold. The shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally, pooling into corners of the room. Rebecca stood there, her heart pounding, when she heard it, a whisper, faint and chilling. "Leave." She spun around, but the room was empty. Her breath came in short gasps as she backed toward the stairs. She turned to head back to her room and froze. On the wall above the staircase, faint but unmistakable, were scratches, long, jagged marks gouged into the wood. They hadn't been there before. The next morning, Rebecca confronted Thomas. "I'm telling you, something's wrong with this house," she said, her voice trembling. "There are scratches on the wall, whispers in the middle of the night." "Rebecca," Thomas interrupted, placing a hand on her shoulder. "You're stressed. Moving here was a big change. Maybe it's just your nerves." Rebecca pulled away, frustration bubbling inside her. "It's not just me, Thomas. Jamie heard it too. He saw her." Thomas frowned, but said nothing. Instead, he retreated to his study, leaving Rebecca alone with her thoughts. As the day wore on, Rebecca decided to do some cleaning in the attic. The space was cramped and dusty, filled with old trunks and forgotten furniture. As she sifted through the clutter, she found a small wooden box. Inside were faded photographs of a woman and a little girl. The woman's face was stern, her eyes dark and hollow. On the back of one photograph, someone had scrawled in shaky handwriting, "Margaret and Clara, 1952. Rebecca felt a chill run down her spine. She had heard the name before, Margaret Holloway. According to the librarian in town, Margaret had lived in the cottage decades ago. Her daughter, Clara, had gone missing, and Margaret had spiraled into madness, eventually taking her own life. That night, as Rebecca lay in bed, she couldn't stop thinking about the photograph. She drifted into a restless sleep, only to wake hours later to the sound of Jamie's voice. She bolted upright, her heart pounding. "Jamie," she called, hurrying to his room. The door was ajar, and she found him standing by the window, his face pale and his eyes wide. "She's outside," he whispered, pointing to the tree line. Rebecca looked out the window, her breath catching in her throat. There, just beyond the shadows of the forest, stood a woman. She was tall and gaunt, her black hair hanging in tangled strands around her face. But it was her eyes that sent a wave of terror through Rebecca. They were pure black, void of any whites, staring directly at her. Rebecca grabbed Jamie and slammed the curtains shut. "It's okay," she whispered, though her voice was shaking. "You're safe. I won't let her hurt you." The following day, Rebecca decided she needed answers. Leaving Jamie with Thomas, she drove into town and sought out the librarian again. The old woman seemed reluctant to talk at first, but Rebecca's desperation convinced her to share what she knew. Margaret Holloway believed something in the forest took her daughter. The librarian explained, her voice barely above a whisper. She claimed it wasn't human. She begged the townsfolk to help her, but no one believed her. They said she was mad. Rebecca pressed her hands against the table. And the woman I saw, was that Margaret? The librarian nodded grimly. Her spirit is bound to that house. She won't leave until she finds Clara, or until someone forces her out. Rebecca returned to the cottage armed with this new knowledge. But the house was no longer the same. The air felt heavier, the shadows darker. That night, as she sat in the living room, she heard it again, the whispers. But this time, they weren't just in the walls. They were inside her head. Rebecca decided she couldn't let this go on any longer. She had to confront whatever was haunting the cottage. That night, as the clock struck midnight, she lit candles in the living room and placed the photograph of Margaret and Clara in the center of the floor. "I know you're here," she said, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her chest. "You want Clara, don't you? But she's gone. You have to let go." The room grew icy, the candles flickering violently. The black-eyed woman appeared, her form solidifying from the shadows. Her voice was a low hiss, filled with anger and sorrow. "She was mine. They took her from me." Rebecca held her ground. "You can't stay here. You're hurting my family." The woman lunged forward, her movements unnatural and jerky. But as she neared the photograph, her form began to waver. Rebecca grabbed the photo and threw it into the fireplace, the flames consuming it instantly. The woman let out a piercing scream, her body dissolving into smoke. The house trembled, the walls groaning, and then silence. Rebecca collapsed to the floor, tears streaming down her face. It was over. The Winters family left the cottage the next day, vowing never to return. Blackwood Cottage remains abandoned, its windows dark and its walls silent. But those who pass by at night claim to see her, a shadowy figure watching from the edge of the forest, her black eyes still searching. For Victor and Laura Sinclair, the move to Ash Hollow was supposed to be the fresh start they desperately needed. Life in the city had been unkind. A failed business venture had drained their savings, and the relentless pace of urban living had taken its toll on their young daughter, Lily. When Victor inherited the house from a distant uncle, it felt like fate. A sprawling estate surrounded by dense woodland, Ash Hollow seemed like a dream come true. The house was old, with weathered stone walls and ivy creeping up its sides. Its grandeur was unmistakable, but there was something about it that felt heavy. Laura brushed it off as the weight of their recent struggles, while Victor saw only the opportunity to rebuild. Lily, ever the optimist, was thrilled by the prospect of exploring the sprawling grounds. On the day they arrived, the weather was bleak. Thick clouds hung low in the sky, and a cold wind rustled the trees. As they stepped inside, the air felt still, almost stagnant, and the faint scent of damp wood lingered. The house was a maze of rooms, some locked and others filled with dust-covered furniture. A grand staircase led to the upper floors, where the bedrooms were located. At the heart of the house was a massive sitting room with a stone fireplace that seemed to dominate the space. "Home sweet home," Victor declared, forcing a smile as he set down a box. Lily ran off to explore, her laughter echoing through the hallways. Laura, though smiling, felt a twinge of unease. Something about the house felt wrong, but she pushed the thought aside. It was just a house, after all, a house that had been in Victor's family for generations. That night, as they settled into their rooms, the house creaked and groaned with the weight of its age. Laura found herself lying awake, staring at the ceiling. The wind outside howled, and for a moment, she thought she heard faint footsteps in the hallway. She sat up, straining to listen, but the sound was gone. The next morning, Lily was brimming with excitement. "Mommy, can I play in the garden? There's a swing out there." Laura nodded, relieved to see her daughter so happy. Victor spent the day unpacking and fixing small issues around the house, while Laura explored the attic. It was filled with old trunks, dusty portraits, and yellowed papers. One trunk, locked and bound with iron clasps, caught her attention. She made a mental note to ask Victor about it later. As the day wore on, the sky darkened unnaturally early. A storm rolled in, lightning illuminating the house in brief, blinding flashes. That night, as they sat by the fireplace, the power flickered and went out. They lit candles, creating a warm glow that failed to dispel the oppressive darkness. "Just a storm," Victor said, but his tone lacked conviction. Upstairs, Lily's laughter suddenly rang out, startling them both. Laura rose quickly, her heart racing. "Lily?" she called, climbing the stairs. She found Lily in her room, sitting cross-legged on the floor, whispering to the corner. "Who are you talking to?" Laura asked, her voice trembling. Lily turned to her, her face serene. "My friend. She says her name is Rose." Laura froze, her stomach tightening. The corner was empty, but the shadows seemed darker, deeper. The next morning, Laura told Victor about Lily's friend. He shrugged it off, saying children often had imaginary companions. "It's probably just her way of adjusting to the move," he said. But Laura wasn't convinced. She couldn't forget the way Lily had spoken, as if she truly believed someone had been there. Determined to distract herself, Laura returned to the attic. The locked trunk called to her, its iron clasps tarnished with age. She searched the house for a key, eventually finding one in a drawer in Victor's study. It was small and ornate, clearly designed for something specific. When the lock clicked open, Laura felt a chill run down her spine. Inside, she found a collection of faded photographs, handwritten letters, and a small, intricately carved wooden box. The photos depicted a young girl, no older than Lily, with long, dark hair and a solemn expression. One photo showed her standing in front of the house, holding a doll with glassy eyes. On the back of the photo, a name was scrawled, Rose, 1894. The letters were addressed to a woman named Eleanor, written in an elegant but hurried hand. The writer spoke of strange occurrences at Ash Hollow, whispers in the night, objects moving on their own, and the overwhelming presence of something unseen. One letter ended abruptly, the ink smudged as though the writer's hand had trembled. Laura opened the wooden box last. Inside was a small, silver locket. When she opened it, she found a miniature portrait of Rose. The girl's painted eyes seemed to stare directly at her, unblinking. That night, Laura dreamed of Rose. In the dream, the girl stood at the foot of her bed, her dark hair framing her pale face. Her lips didn't move, but Laura heard her voice clearly. "Help me?" Over the following days, Lily grew more withdrawn. She spent hours alone in her room, whispering to her friend. Laura tried to engage her, but Lily always seemed distracted, her gaze drifting toward the shadows. One afternoon, Laura found Lily sitting on the swing in the overgrown garden. "What are you doing out here?" Laura asked, her voice tinged with worry. "Rose said I should play outside," Lily replied matter-of-factly. "She doesn't like being in the house." Laura knelt beside her daughter. "Lily, you know Rose isn't real, right? She's just pretend." Lily frowned. "She's real, Mommy. She told me about the bad thing in the house." Laura felt a chill run down her spine. "What bad thing?" she asked, trying to keep her voice calm. Lily didn't answer. Instead, she pointed to the attic window. Laura followed her gaze and froze. A shadowy figure stood there, motionless, watching them. Desperate for answers, Laura dug deeper into the house's history. She visited the local library, where she uncovered records of a tragic fire at Ash Hollow in 1894. Rose and her mother, Eleanor, had perished in the blaze, their bodies never recovered. Local legends claimed the fire had been set deliberately, a desperate attempt to rid the house of a dark force. Laura returned home armed with this knowledge, but the house was no longer the same. Shadows stretched unnaturally, the walls seemed to groan with unseen pressure, and the air was thick with an oppressive stillness. Victor dismissed her concerns, chalking it up to stress, but Laura knew better. That night, as they sat in the living room, the whispers began. They started faintly, like wind through the trees, but grew louder and more insistent. Objects flew off shelves, and the lights flickered violently. Lily screamed, clutching her bear. "It's coming," she cried. Laura knew they couldn't stay another night. She gathered Lily and Victor, but the house seemed intent on keeping them. Doors slammed shut, windows locked themselves, and the air grew icy. In the chaos, Laura remembered the locket. She retrieved it from the trunk and held it tightly. "Rose," she whispered, "I know you're here. Help us." The shadows recoiled, and the temperature in the room dropped further. Rose appeared, her form faint and flickering, but her presence was unmistakable. She pointed to the fireplace, her expression urgent. Laura didn't hesitate. She threw the locket into the flames. The house shook violently, and a deafening roar filled the air. The shadows screamed, their forms writhing as they dissolved into nothingness. When the chaos subsided, the house fell silent. Rose was gone, her spirit finally at peace. The Sinclairs fled Ash Hollow, leaving everything behind. The estate remains abandoned, a silent reminder of the curse that once dwelled there.